What if the quietest student in the room turned out to be the most brilliant mind no one saw coming? What if a simple classroom debate transformed into a legendary battle of intellect? Today we uncover the day a professor's attempt to humiliate a student took an unexpected turn, because that student was Barron Trump. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll witness a moment that changed everything. Some professors teach math, others teach politics. But what happens when one professor tries to do both, in a class full of students expecting calculus? At one of America's most prestigious universities, a storm was brewing in the mathematics department. The name Dr. Linda Markham was well known, not just for her sharp intellect, but for her sharp opinions. A professor of advanced calculus, she had made it clear in recent years that mathematics to her was more than just numbers. It was a battleground for social justice. She stood before her students, marker in hand, but instead of an equation, 3 words appeared on the board, redefining academic priorities. The murmurs in the room were subtle at first, then they grew. Some students shifted in their seats. Some wrote the words down, not knowing what was to come. But in the back row, one student didn't react. Not yet. He was watching, waiting, and listening. He sat in the back, unnoticed, unbothered. No one knew his secret, but today, that was about to change. Tall, composed, and silent, Barron Trump had spent the entire semester avoiding unnecessary attention. He wasn't one for small talk. He didn't indulge in debates or class discussions. Most students barely knew him. Some whispered that he had only been admitted because of his last name. Others assumed he wasn't particularly interested in the subject. But what no one knew, not even Dr. Markham, was that behind his quiet demeanor was a mind that thrived on logic, precision, and an insatiable hunger for knowledge. And today, that mind was about to be tested in a way no one expected. The air was heavy. Something was off. Today's lesson wasn't about numbers. It was about control. But one student was about to challenge everything. Dr. Markham paced in front of the classroom, speaking with confidence, but with something more, something sharper. Her words carried an edge, her tone laced with conviction. Mathematics is important, she declared, but so is understanding the structures that uphold privilege in academia. We must question who is truly earning their place, and who is simply given it. A pause, a flicker of tension rippled through the room. Some students looked around, hesitant. Others lowered their heads, scribbling notes, pretending not to notice the shift in atmosphere. And then a single hand rose into the air. One hand, just one hand in the air, was all it took to shift the entire energy of the room, and it belonged to Barron Trump. The murmurs stopped. The air thickened. Dr. Markham turned, eyes narrowing slightly. She hadn't expected him to speak. For a moment she studied him, then a smirk. "Yes, Mr. Trump? Do you have something to contribute?" His voice was steady, respectful, but firm. "Professor, if we replace core subjects with ideological debates, doesn't that disadvantage students regardless of their background?" A silence fell over the room. Some students exchanged glances, a few nodded subtly, and for the first time that semester, the professor had no immediate response. Most students freeze when faced with an impossible problem. But Barron? He didn't just accept the challenge, he raised the stakes. Dr. Markham's smirk returned, but this time there was something else behind it, a test, a challenge, a moment she thought would prove a point. Turning to the board, she lifted her marker. Her hand moved swiftly, crafting an equation, a problem that was far beyond the level of any undergraduate student, complex, ruthless, meant to intimidate. And then she stepped back. "Since you seem to favor traditional academics, let's see how well you fare with this." The equation stood between them like a wall of numbers. Some students stared at it, already feeling the weight of its difficulty. One student murmured, "That's graduate-level work." And then Barron did something no one expected. He didn't hesitate. He didn't waver. He simply stood up, walked to the front, and studied the board. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't with panic. It wasn't with uncertainty. It was with curiosity. "Would you prefer I solve this using the standard approach, or the more elegant method Leibniz described in his original papers?" The professor's smirk disappeared. The room fell into stunned silence. A hush fell over the room. This wasn't going how the professor planned. And then he said something that left even her speechless. She had expected hesitation, a struggle, a moment of panic, but instead Barron stood there, eyes scanning the equation, completely at ease. His question had caught her off guard. He hadn't just accepted the challenge, he had changed the rules of the game. The reference to Leibniz wasn't casual. It was deliberate, precise, and it meant one thing. He had studied mathematics far beyond what was expected at his level. The professor's fingers tightened around the marker. The smirk on her face had vanished. She had thrown down the gauntlet. But instead of watching a student crumble under pressure, she was staring at something else entirely. A mind that had already solved the problem before even picking up the marker. Step by step, he solved it, not just with precision, but with brilliance. And the professor? She had only one question left. Who is this kid? Barron lifted the marker and, with steady hands, began writing. The room was silent. Not a single cough, not a single whisper. The only sound was the quiet scratch of marker against whiteboard. His movements were deliberate, confident, every step explained with clarity, as though he was not just solving the problem but teaching it to the entire room. Concepts that had once seemed abstract were now unfolding with breathtaking simplicity. And then something incredible happened. Students, many of whom had struggled with calculus, began nodding along, understanding the process in real time. For the first time in that classroom, the lesson wasn't about politics, it was about mathematics. As Barron reached the final step, he paused. The equation, once a tangled mess of symbols, now sat neatly resolved on the board. The solution was complete. He capped the marker and turned, his face calm, unshaken. The professor, arms crossed, stared at the board. A long silence followed, and then a single clap, then another, and within seconds the entire room erupted in applause. The problem was solved, but the real challenge was just beginning. Would the professor accept the truth, or find a new way to regain control? Dr. Markham's jaw tightened. This was not how today was supposed to go. She had set the stage for a lesson on privilege, a moment to reframe the conversation. But instead, she had just witnessed something that defied her expectations. A student she had dismissed outperformed her challenge with ease. She could feel the eyes of the students on her, waiting, expecting. The applause had died down, but the weight of the moment remained. And then the door to the lecture hall burst open. Just when it seemed like the classroom drama had peaked, the door burst open. A new player had entered the game, and he wasn't here for small talk. Dean Richardson strode into the room, his presence commanding. A known supporter of Dr. Markham's educational philosophy, he had clearly heard about the events unfolding. "Linda," he said, his voice sharp, "we need you for an emergency faculty meeting about the curriculum changes." The timing was impeccable, almost too perfect. Dr. Markham exhaled, shoulders relaxing. An exit had presented itself. She turned to the class and smiled, the control returning to her voice. "We'll have to continue this discussion another time," she said, reaching for her things. But before she could step away, Barron's voice cut through the air. "Professor," he said, "you challenged me to solve this problem in front of everyone. Walking away now would teach an unfortunate lesson about academic integrity." A ripple of murmurs spread through the classroom. The dean's expression hardened. The professor hesitated, her back still turned, but she had heard him. So had everyone else. One final test, one final equation. But this time it wasn't about humiliation. It was about something much bigger. The professor turned back to face him. For a moment she seemed ready to argue, ready to deflect. But then her gaze shifted to the board, to the solved equation, and in that instant, something shifted. She had a choice: walk away and prove Barron right, or face the truth in front of the entire class. The room held its breath. And then something unexpected happened. Dr. Markham exhaled, then straightened. "Fine," she said. "Since you're so sure of yourself, let's take it a step further. Solve it another way. Right here. Right now." Without hesitation, Barron nodded. "Of course." And with that he lifted the marker again. Some lessons are learned in books, others in battle. But today, a new kind of education had just begun. This time, there was no tension, no power struggle, just a student proving, once again, that mathematics belonged to no ideology, only truth. By the time he was done, the classroom felt different. The students weren't just watching. They were engaged, inspired. The energy had shifted from conflict to curiosity. Dr. Markham, standing at the front, finally met Barron's gaze, and for the first time there was no smugness, no dismissal, only recognition. "I underestimated you," she said quietly. She thought it was over, but as she flipped through the pages of his notebook, she realized she had just witnessed history in the making. As the class ended, students packed their things, still buzzing from what they had seen. Dr. Markham, now alone at her desk, reached for something left behind. A notebook. It was Barron's. But when she flipped it open, she didn't find lecture notes. She found something else. Equations, theories, mathematical models she had never seen before. It wasn't just a student's notebook. It was the work of a mind far beyond his years. For a long moment, she simply stared. And then she closed the book, exhaled, and whispered to herself, "Who is this kid?" The quietest student in the room turned out to be the loudest voice for truth. And today, he didn't just solve a problem. He changed the game. If you loved this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. What should Barron take on next?